Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Len Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma-informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma-Informed Lens Podcast. I'm here today to talk to a special guest, Karen Gross, about our shared passion for trauma-sensitive education. And also, I think such a crucial and really a great fit in what we've been talking about the last few episodes about some of the challenges of reopening, both of serving, whether it's students, clients, patients who have also been through the stress and trauma of the pandemic, but also for our staff as well. So when I got connected with Karen, I was like, this could not be a more perfect guest for where we are at, where I am at, my thinking about the next few months. And it is, Karen, it is great to connect with you. Wow, a sister that I haven't met yet with a shared passion. So before we dive into this crucial conversation, tell our guests a little bit about yourself, your expertise and experience as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. And Matt, I'm glad we share such an important topic and passion at this time.
Yes.
It is sorely needed to have experts in trauma and trauma sensitivity and trauma responsiveness. So it's really my pleasure to be here with you. So I'm by training an educator. And I spend most of my time thinking about student success. And that means students, by the way, from early childhood all the way through adulthood. And I still teach, by the way, so that everything that I do is grounded in the trenches, so to speak, so that I can test out the strategies I suggest to people, that I can see what's happening in classrooms for students at all ages and stages. And while I focus on student success, what I really spend most of my time on now is the impact of trauma on learning and psychosocial development.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, I pay attention to the impact of trauma, both primary, secondary, and vicarious, on educators. Because sadly, trauma is catching like a virus. And so we need to care not only about our students, but also about our educators. And I broadly define educators to include those in the classroom, those working with students as coaches, those who meet them in the lunchroom, those who see them online, all of the people who are engaged in education. Because as I say frequently, education happens in many places and spaces, of which the classroom is but one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And wow, yes, I just want to say yes, yes, and yes. And so let's, there's so much I want to talk to you about, just that opening statement, but let's talk to what you've seen. You know, and the audience knows my wife's a first grade teacher. I've run schools in the past. So definitely a key passion of mine. And I'm interested in, I know I have my own, kind of secondary experience of what my wife is going through as they've reopened, shut down again, reopened again. And I've had a nice string of success in Boulder, Colorado, at least. What do you, as you start to look at what has happened to our students over the last 14 months? And I always like to say, granted, COVID is the maybe the key indicator here, but I always like to talk about, especially as we talk about maybe some older youth, but I know younger, we're recording this 2 days after the George Floyd trial verdicts. So we've had the biggest civil rights movement in my lifetime. We've also had the craziest political environment in my lifetime as well. So when you look at everything kind of in this capsule of, you and I have a passion. We had a passion before 14 months ago for kids experiencing trauma. What are you seeing coming out of this just unprecedented time with the students? Some transitioning back in the classroom, some maybe not until next year. What are you seeing sort of on the ground in your experience and hearing from others?
So let me go back a little bit and say that before the pandemic, there was trauma, and there were many students and many adults who experienced trauma. And I think it's important to recognize that we were not exactly on top of the issue then. And whether the trauma was person caused or nature caused or family caused or part of systemic racism or systemic ethnic discrimination, that existed before the pandemic.
Absolutely.
But as you rightly point out, and by the way, the numbers on that are that about 50% pre-pandemic and pre all these other things we'll talk about 50 to 60% of all children had experienced at least one trauma, and 60 to 70% of all adults. Well, if you think now about the pandemic and you add to the pandemic what you've also described in terms of racial and ethnic disruption and the recognition or increased recognition of systemic discrimination. And if you think about the natural disasters that we've had between fires and floods, which have affected many, many people in our nation. And you add to that the raid on the Capitol and deaths and verdicts, you can see that the amount of trauma has increased multifold for students and their teachers. So let me just divide up for a minute what's happened to students and then what's happened to teachers.
Great.
So students, whether they're learning online or hybrid or in person, bring their trauma with them in what I call an invisible backpack. It's not like you have a big T on you or something. So this invisible backpack keeps growing because an early trauma can get re-triggered by another trauma. And so the backpacks we carry as we age get bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the true downsides of trauma is that it never goes away. You can't erase what's happened in one's past, but one can most assuredly ameliorate it. And so what we need is to recognize the trauma, which impacts learning, impacts cognition, impacts memory, impacts concentration. Indeed, it literally shuts neural pathways that we have. So we have to recognize what it does, and then we have to find the strategies to ameliorate it. And by the way, all this trauma that students have been experiencing is not of their own making.
Right.
It's something that happened to them. It's not something they did.
Right.
So the way I describe this actually is through a visual involving my hand, if that's okay to do that with you so we can. So if you picture your fist as a brain, and you picture here as being the primitive part of the brain stem, and this part up here is your cognition. And inside there is your limbic system, which is your feeling center. And so when the brain is working well, it kind of looks like this. When you experience trauma, the first thing that happens is there's acute symptomology, and what your brain does is it literally flips out. So when kids say they're flipped out, they actually are flipped out. And by the way, this little thing with your hand is very useful for them to understand because it explains what's happening to them. Yeah. And sometimes instead of the limbic system being inside, it hijacks the cognition. So it's on the outside. But what's happening at the beginning is here. It's in the primitive brain. And if you can't get the autonomic nervous system under control, which is acute symptomology, then all the learning and the expertise of a teacher doesn't matter. Yeah. It's sort of like saying the best reading teacher, the best first grade reading teacher can't teach students who haven't had breakfast. Right. I don't care how good he or she is. And so the key here is to get the autonomic nervous system under some control. Now, even if you do that, there's deferred trauma symptomology, which is triphasic, dysregulation, disassociation, and overregulation, which I can explain in greater detail in a second if you want. But the point is that trauma produces symptomology. We need to ameliorate the symptomology. And then we have to recognize the importance of all of this, because in the absence of recognizing it, we won't deal with it. So here's my architecture for this. You have to name it, namely name trauma. You have to tame it, as in ameliorate it. And then you have to frame it, as in put it in a frame and recognize its importance, and also create a frame, as in like a house structure, to scaffold it so that we deal with it effectively. Wow. So that's basically what's happening to students. And if we want to help them, we have to name, tame, and frame trauma.
So one of the, and I love that framework, and frame again, there we go, scaffold myself there. But, one of the things that I have such a passion for with the education piece, and let's start with the name structure of this, is, both my work in education, and I think in hindsight, fortunate to be in special education, because you talk about that autonomic regulation. My kids were basically too violent for the public school system. So their autonomic system was, their amygdala was in charge most of the time. And we had to, so it was a really great challenge, because most things we thought worked for students, like putting beautiful, stimulating stuff all over the school, was actually counterproductive for most of the youth I worked with. So I got this great crash course in that. And I was in that situation before I saw the adverse childhood experience study. So I kind of had that framework and then kind of got the why afterwards. How do you help educators? Because I think one of the things that drives my passion, but also my frustration is, we see the behavior, we see the academic struggles, and historically in education, we sort of start to put labels on children. And I watch this sometimes, like my wife being a first grade teacher, they talk about all the kids coming in the next year, and they talk about all the kids, but it's like, well, Johnny's coming, so you better start going to church and praying, because Johnny's doing, God knows what Johnny's supposed to be doing. I love my wife because that Johnny always becomes her favorite student throughout the next year. But how do we start to reframe this? How do you help educators to say this behavior in the classroom is not a child weighing consequences and treasure boxes and point systems, but that their nervous system is really struggling, even in the best situations, to stay regulated? How do you help folks change the paradigm of behavioral and learning to say, this, and I think it's just ridiculous to say, this third grader is not weighing their light point or treasure box consequences when they act out. And how do you help to change that mindset with folks?
So I think part of the problem is that educators are not trauma trained. Yeah. And many schools of education actually don't even offer courses in trauma.
Right.
And so teachers, in their effort to teach, well-intentioned, often misdiagnose or mischaracterize why it is that students are acting out. And so one piece of this is to help educators learn what it means to be trauma responsive. What's trauma responsive pedagogy? What's trauma responsive institutional norming and the like. But I actually hold out a fair amount of hope for this reason. And at this point in time, and this is really important, and I want to go back to Katrina. When Katrina happened, one of the pieces of literature that came out of that is that therapists and their clients had a very different relationship because of Katrina, because they both experienced the same horrible event and its consequences. And so the normal dividing line where students have one set of experiences based on their youth and educators have another set of experiences actually is much closer now. Now, I'm not suggesting crossing boundaries at all.
Right.
What I am suggesting, though, is that teachers, because they too, with their families and friends, have experienced the pandemic, there's a window there for them to understand that if they can understand what they're experiencing, then they can better understand what their students are experiencing. And so we have a really unique opportunity here. If we help teachers understand their own trauma, both primary trauma from the pandemic, the secondary trauma that they catch from students, and the vicarious trauma, which is also something you can catch, then they'll be better able to help their students. Now, to be fair, there are a whole group of people who think, oh, well, trauma is just a trend, and this is snowflaking and, not being rigorous enough intellectually, and we're coddling our kids, and, we ought to let them pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And I get individualism, but here's my theory. For me, if the end game is to help students learn and to help them succeed and become their best selves, then it doesn't matter what we do to help them. We should help them because that's our job. And it's also what's right for them and for us as a nation. It's not coddling to help people. It's not lowering academic standards. What it is giving people the tools and the environment that will enable them to succeed. So I've done a lot of training of teachers in an effort to help them understand trauma. And then in turn, that actually helps them understand the trauma that their students are experiencing. But there's one more piece to this that really matters, which is that it's very hard to teach a whole group of traumatized students if you're not taking care of yourself and if you don't understand what's happening to yourself. The expression I use is you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
And so what we need to help teachers realize is that self-care is not selfish, and we need to help them understand what's going on. In fact, there are a group of us who formed a virtual teachers lounge as a pilot. And the goal of the virtual teachers lounge, well, there were several goals, was to enable educators to get together with facilitators to talk about what was happening, what strategies they were using, how they were doing, giving them an opportunity to vent, but also to see that others shared the frustrations they had. Because in the online world or the hybrid world or the socially distanced world, you don't have that same opportunity that you used to have with a teacher's room where you could pop in, share what was on your mind, engage with your colleagues. So we created this virtual teachers lounge, which has been an amazing experience in terms of not only helping teachers, but learning ways that we can help them on a go forward basis. So
awesome. Well, I'm excited to jump into that. But before I do, because I think this crosses us over between the student and the educator. And one of the things I wonder, because here in Colorado, a different kind of reality. You're in Massachusetts, that liberal hub out there on the East Coast with all your resources and all that stuff. I wonder, one of the challenges I have, and when I hit a challenge, I try to turn that into advocacy very quickly, because I like to say, you hit a wall, you better find out who's on the other side and talk to that person, because just running up against that wall doesn't do you any good or anybody else any good. It's, on one hand, totally, absolutely agree. In fact, my argument to principals who are talking to me about, staff, why would we bring this in? Well, really, it's to raise your test scores. If I want to talk their language, it's like, I can get into the humanistic part that it's the right thing to do and all that, but it's really, we're creating a learning environment where all children thrive. And that's in many ways, we can call it a trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive school environment. Great. But really, we're creating a neurobiologically friendly environment. For the analogy you used with the fist and the brain, we're creating an environment that, with mindfulness or brain breaks or just paying attention to how much stimulation is in the classrooms, we're building an environment where all kids can succeed. The one of the struggles, and this is both from the student and I think the challenge of trauma-sensitive schools on one hand, but also the self-care of educators is, okay, now Matt or Karen, come to your training. I know I can automatically say 5 of my kids in my classroom I know are struggling with trauma. And 2 of those are shutting down, I think. 3 of those are throwing chairs at their classmates on a regular basis. And how do I'm one person, I've got 25 second graders in the room. How do I give those children, those students, what they need to regulate and teach the other children effectively as well? And I think then we fall back on punishment and rewards, because there may not, at least in my opinion, the answer to that is get more teacher assistants. I don't like the word para all that much. We need to get more support in the classrooms, and that investment will pay off many times over, in my opinion, when those children are given what they need to succeed and not become the bad kid or the academically below perform, because we can help those youth. They just need more relational support. They need more regulation support. They need more academic support because of what they've been through. And I wonder how you approach that issue that I know is prevalent, so much out here. Again, I think we look at the liberal Massachusetts as maybe you've got more better ratios in your classroom, but I'm sure you hear some of those struggles too with your travels and your trainings as well.
So, not all of Massachusetts is Boston and Cambridge.
What are you talking about?
So let me fight a little bit with your hypothetical. I don't think it's 5 kids out of 25 that are traumatized. I think it's vastly more than that.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing for me is that trauma is an equal opportunity offender.
Absolutely.
While it hits disproportionately in terms of low-income minority and racially diverse students, all students can experience trauma, and many have experienced trauma who are in socioeconomic groups that normally we don't group together with low-income students.
Yeah.
And so it's important, I think, to realize that trauma doesn't have an arrow to the poor. All right. Now, with that in mind, I use the following description, and I'm going to give you an example. Trauma-responsive pedagogy and trauma-responsive environments are like a rising tide that lifts all boats. Mm-hmm. The strategies help all students, yes, whether or not you're traumatized. So the question for me isn't, how can I help the 20? And oops, what about these 5 or 6 non-traumatized kids? The question is, how can I teach in a way that enhances all students. And so trauma responsive strategies are not uniquely good because they help trauma. They do that, but they also help all other students. And so the answer is, if you can educate the teachers, and I might add the administrators,
Yes.
About, which is another important piece that, I have said that for all the trainings I've done with teachers in the last 18 months, I should have done more with administrators. And I take that as a really good criticism of the work that I've done, because if the administrators aren't on board, you can make micro changes in classrooms. And by the way, that's very good and really important. But in a sense, if you think about it like baseball, it's like you can keep getting hits. Okay, that's good. But if you have no defense and you can't catch, then you're not going to be able to win. Yeah. So micro changes are important, but so are macro changes, and they come primarily from the top, and you need both the top and the bottom to work. But let me give you an example of the kind of strategies that I use. And I should tell you and your listeners that pre-pandemic, I'm a psychological first aid provider. So I used to go to disaster sites and concert shootings, school shootings, immigration detention, and work with the people who interfaced with all of the people who had experienced whatever bad thing happened. And I remember distinctly going to one of those places where there were a number of lawyers who worked with children who had been detained, and their job was to be the lawyer for the detained children. Now, whatever your view is on immigration, this was a very hard job, right? Their clients were 2, 3, and 4 years, 5 years old. So they had asked me to come to talk about, what does childhood trauma look like? How would they recognize it? And would these children have it? The answer is yes, they'd have it. And yes, you will be able to detect it. But as I started,
some questions are easy to answer.
So as I started, a woman raised her hand and she said, "Excuse me, I think I need this training for me. I get that you're helping us with strategies for these children." And actually, I had read to some of the children. I'd worked with some of the children in a playroom. They said, I think maybe you should stop now and stop with the children thing and help us, because we're all in real trouble here. Can you do that? Can you change? And instead of focusing on the children and how to help them, could you focus on how to help us? Yeah. And I realized then that maybe the key into all of this is actually through teachers who recognize and self-reflect enough to know that they can benefit from trauma responsive strategies themselves, and then start to see it in their children, their own children, but the children that they teach or the adults that they teach.
Absolutely.
So now here's one thing that's been really troubling to me of late. And I'm sure, given that your wife has been in schools have closed and reopened, and sometimes closed and reopened as if they were light switches.
Yeah.
We shut them down, and then whoops, we open, and then we shut. Okay, now on a good day, we're not good with transitions, but schools are not light switches. You can't just turn them off and then turn them on. And part of the problem is that when we have tried to turn them on, and as we try to turn schools on, and organizations and social service agencies and medical facilities and workplaces, as we try to open them, our focus has largely been on physical safety. Now, that's important. Are the desks sufficiently far apart? Do we have enough sanitizers? Do we have enough air circulating? Do we have enough masks and social distancing? What are we going to do about food? How do we walk down the halls? What do you do if someone gets sick? Okay, I get that, but unfortunately, physical well-being has taken over the stage, and we are not paying attention to psychological well-being. And we have really neglected the realization that many people will be returning, whether it's to school or to a social service agency or to a workplace, with lots of things in their backpack that were not there before. And if we don't deal with them, the fact that students are present, as in there, doesn't mean they're ready, willing, and able to learn.
Yeah.
And so much of my time now is spent thinking about what should we do when we reopen schools in August or September. And let's not think about that in August or September. Let's think about that now, so that we can take those steps and do that thinking and plan and prepare and predict now, even though it seems far off, because otherwise we will not have students who are truly present and truly, whatever their age, truly able to learn. So that's my current focus. That's my concern right now. I'm deeply worried about the reopening of all things without adequate attention to the mental well-being of everybody within those institutions.
Well, and that really brings me to what I'm trying, and I think schools opened up before a lot of kind of social services, but the clinics I work with too have never shut down in this whole thing. And I think, you know, on one hand, I think we are, if you're going to ask a group of people, be them healthcare professionals, social workers, or educators, to say, we need you to sacrifice pretty much all your health and wellness for the benefit of your patients, students, clients. We are designed to do that. We are just like, okay, we will step up, we will change, like just appreciating what the difference is between in-person teaching and online teaching. It's a whole different job. And how many teachers spend 80 hours a week trying to do it adequately? And one of the things that I've really been trying to harp, especially on the leadership level, is thinking about a recovery plan, like almost like a strategic plan, because, and I would love to get your thought on this. One of the things I've been catching myself on, and I've been doing this for a while, self-care and trauma-informed leadership was like, those were actually my first trainings that I actually ever did many, many years ago in this arena. And one of the recent survey that I saw is we have the most burned out professions are physicians, nurses, social service, social workers, teachers, and principals. And I think we talk so much about self-care and what is the individual's responsibility for their own wellness. And that has to be part of the thinking. And I think it's got to be a big part of the thinking. But if your system, if the leaders and the providers and teachers, again, being the key piece in education, though we'll talk about educators in general, they're mentally ill because they're in this system. I just like to kind of throw out the question is, self-care has got to be a piece of this, but there's that one self-care analogy, which I'm just starting to use for the first time, is put your mask on. If the oxygen and the plane's all going out, put your mask on before you help somebody else. But we're all on this plane that's crashing. And it's like, we're putting the responsibility on the people in the plane that the plane is crashing. I just kind of, from that systems level and knowing principals are being destroyed by this work too. I mean, literally, like number 5 on the list, how are they going to support teachers? And then how are teachers going to support students? What do you have any?
I have some ideas.
Okay, great. So solve this problem for me, because I think
it's not an easy problem to solve.
The system is so broke. How do we even start to say principals support teachers, teachers support students when everybody's traumatized in a lot of ways, and to use that word with all the caution that I do?
Right. Well, first of all, not all trauma is mental illness. We can debate that. That's a whole other set of conversations about what's a diagnosable medical illness or mental illness. So I have a set of suggestions for reopening. And it's actually 11 questions, but I'll just share some of them with you, because the idea is that if you start thinking about them in a collaborative, non-siloed way, that will help. And so what we've unfortunately done is we've had decisions across education and other sectors that haven't been all inclusive in their decision making. So schools, principals have made hosts of decisions, school boards have, teachers, school nurses, school psychologists often haven't even been involved in those conversations. So, and that's true in other organizations as well. So I want to suggest that collective thinking is way more likely to produce buy-in if you do that. So my first suggestion is that I think every institution, every school, every workplace should create a trauma team today. Well, they should have done it yesterday, but today's good enough. And the idea is it will be composed of people across the institution to share and think about what needs to be done to prepare for what's happening. Do people need training? Do people need to read certain things? Do we need certain kinds of communications? But then importantly, that trauma team will be there on site at their institution for the first couple weeks that that institution reopens. And they will be there to provide for both, if it's a school, faculty and staff and coaches and others, as well as students. If it's a medical facility, it will be there for the medical providers as well as for patients. And in a clinical social work setting, it will be there for both the social workers and those who assist them, as well as for the clients that they see. And in fact, I teach in the continuing education program at the Rutgers Graduate School of Social Work. And many of the programs that I do there are designed to enable the organizations where people work to be more functional and more aware of what they need to do. So my first suggestion is we need to create trauma teams. And I have to say that part of the reason is that I know that works is that I worked at an institution right near ground zero for 9/11. And the schools shut down, the area shut down, the whole community shut down. And the question was, when we reopen, what do we do? How do we do that well? I mean, it's not like you pick up your book and say, like, where were we before we were so rudely interrupted by 2 planes crashing into the World Trade Center?
Exactly.
And so I, worked hard with a number of other people to make sure that our reopening was not simply just like restarting by flipping the light switch. So get a trauma team in place and have them there for the first few weeks and have them easily accessible. And I think those teams can include people from the institution. It can also include an outsider or two if that person is trauma trained and well enough aware of either educational institutions or social service institutions or healthcare institutions. Now is not the time for the person who's never been in those places to come and give trauma advice if they don't know a whole lot about schools or social services or whatever healthcare is being delivered. So that's my first suggestion. And I would say to institutions, here are my list of questions. My first one, do you have a trauma team in place?
Yeah.
And if you don't, you should think about getting one. So that's my first suggestion. My second suggestion is to think about space and place. So for institutions that have been closed and have not had clients in or students in, what do we do with the space and place? Do we keep it exactly as it was? Or do we create something different in that space? How do we use what we know about trauma to change and think about the space and place? Now, some people would say, well, classrooms have all the stuff that was left up from last year. Do we take it all down? Do we put up new stuff? What do we put in the halls? What do we put on the walls? So that's a question people have to think about, but I can give you a couple of suggestions. Every institution should have a place where all the people within the institution can anonymously express what they're feeling. Whether that's a wall where you post a sticky and say, I'm not doing so well today, or I'm better today, to taking up the floor and putting down the equivalent of writing boards on the floor, and then people can chalk them and then wipe out the chalk. But the bottom line is you need to rethink space and place. And what were in stairwells before? Should you put something in there? Should you add color? Should you put some art in there? Should you let people paint? I mean, what kind of activities can you do, many of which could be designed to encourage connection? Because one of the things that has happened is that connection has been truncated. Our brains are wired for connection, literally wired for connection. And yet what trauma does is it truncates connection. It literally shuts down neural pathways. And when that happens, you have to rebuild neural pathways. Now, the good news is our brains are plastic. We have neuroplasticity, but we have to do that. And we have to rebuild connection. And by the way, social distancing and masks haven't made this connection thing any easier.
Not at all.
So we need ways to create connection. So installation art projects, shared feeling activities are all very relevant. And for the person who says to me, oh, wait, I got to get to content, my answer is your content isn't going in unless all this other stuff is in place. Try though you may. You can't open someone's head and pour in the stuff. It's not going to go. It's not going to stay in. Okay. So I would say have the second question for institutions of all sorts. The first one is, do you have a trauma team in place? The second one is, what are you doing with space and place to create something different from what was that encourages engagement and connectivity? Okay, the third question. What are you doing the first day people come back and maybe for the first week? What are you going to do? Just open the door? Or maybe instead you should have a remarkable array of people out there. And if it's an elementary school, go dress people up. One administrator said to me, well, I'm going to be at the door with my thermometer reading off a list. And I said, really? Why don't you put on a funny hat and a wig and decorate the thermometer and bring out a team of other people and stuffed animals and people who are dressed up like rabbits and giraffes? I mean, why not greet people in a way that says, welcome back. We are so glad you're here. And that includes the bus drivers who drop them off and the parents or guardians or friends who drive them and carpool them. I would change the greeting. I would change how we do the greeting. Think of what signage you might want to put outside. Think about it as creating a red carpet event where students go, oh, wow, I am so glad to be here. I feel so welcomed.
Yeah.
I am so happy that school is open. That's what we need. Okay. Fourth suggestion. So you ask, do you have a trauma team in place? What are you doing with your space and place? How are you doing the first day or week in terms of meeting and greeting? And here's the fourth one. How do you communicate as leaders with all the people who are your constituencies starting now? Well, shouldn't you be sending a daily email to all faculty and staff? Couldn't you send something to every student? Doesn't have to be long.
Yeah.
It could be short. Oh, let's have a countdown. It's, 29 days until this. Or I just wanted to share a self-care strategy I learned about last week for teachers. Whatever you say, regular, consistent, stable communication that's transparent and honest and consistent. Because one of the things that trauma does is it decreases structure, it decreases stability, it decreases safety, not in terms of personal safety, but in terms of psychic safety, safe space. Why not reinstitute that through communication? So when the pandemic started, there was a leader of a very large healthcare organization. And he came to me and he said, I employ 10,000 people, all of whom are going to be working remotely now, or the vast majority of them. How do I keep my organization together and the millions of people that we serve? And I said, you should do a daily email every single day. He said, you got to be kidding me. I mean, what am I going to say? I said, oh, you'll find plenty to say. The world has filled with things. So for the first month or so, he would send me them. I say, perfect, go ahead. And he happened to be on the West Coast, so it was easy. He'd send it to me. I would make a few tweaks here and there, and then he'd send it out. Okay. He has done this now, and they are so good that there should be a book, 18 months of welcome messages. But many educational institutional leaders have not done that. Yeah. They have not communicated adequately or consistently. And so I want to suggest a totally different communications approach that could start now and would carry through the year. That whatever your constituencies are, they're all served by improved communications. And by the way, it may take a few minutes extra to write an email to all students, a separate one to all faculty and staff, a separate one to parents. It is well worth it. Yeah. Every word you put there, every photograph you put in there, every piece of art you want to share, every idea, poem, thought, suggestion is helpful. So let me leave you with one more. Great. So I think we've done 4, right? Here's the 5th one. Remember, there are 11 altogether. If one wanted the full and complete list. I think institutions need care rooms. I think we need to designate space for care rooms for educators or social workers or healthcare workers. And then we need care rooms for kids, not the same room. And I think those rooms need to be filled with trauma responsive items. Weighted blankets, scents, play tables, safely done in light of COVID, all things that people can use to calm their autonomic nervous system, to find a place and space, psychic space, where they can just get a little relief before they go back to doing what they're doing. And care rooms are very common in certain contexts. So at trauma conferences where you're showing movies that are very difficult to see, they often have simultaneous care rooms. And they say, if the movie's bothering you at any point, go into a care room. There's someone in there. And come back to the movie or stay in the care room or go to the care room after the movie. There are care rooms or breakaway rooms in schools for some kids, cool down rooms for some kids. There's a teacher's room, but I think we specifically need care rooms. Now, schools will say, well, we don't have room because we're spreading kids out now. Yeah. So we have a shortage of space. We don't have a place to put these rooms. Well, I think you have to find a space. Maybe the principal sits in the hall.
Yeah.
I'm actually serious.
No,
And
no, I'm with you. Yeah.
his or her big office to be a care room.
Yeah.
I can't think of actually a better use for the principal's office right now.
Yeah.
The head of school often has two offices, a conference room and an office. Give one up.
Yeah.
And so here's my point. There are a set of things I think we should be asking ourselves now in April and May to prepare us for August and September. Because if we do, I think we will help make the transition to reopening vastly better. And we'll make it better, not just physically, but we'll make it better for the mental wellness of all of us, adults and children alike.
Great. And I 100% agree. I call it the trauma sensitive transformation team within the school environment in my language. So absolutely, and so there's no devil's advocacy in this next statement. It's honestly what I am struggling with as somebody similar in your position who folks are looking for advice at this point in the multiple ways that I give them. And I think help me through your thinking with this is where I get stuck, because I want every school to be trauma sensitive. I want to get, like everything you said, yes, and yes. The thing that I guess I'm really struggling with right now is knowing what it takes from an emotional regulation, a cognitive engagement piece to look at change. Because in many ways, going to trauma responsive or trauma sensitive, trauma informed, but whatever language we want to use, you're really challenging in some ways how a lot of teachers have trained and worked for sometimes decades. And I think one of the things I'm really getting stuck at, not just in education, but across the board, and why I'm sort of hyper focusing on this with folks is knowing the mental health of our staff right now, that a lot of them too, as you've talked about, are struggling with their own trauma, and knowing that teachers, principals were 4 and 5 on that, at least that one survey I saw, we didn't have a whole lot of so-called protective factors going into the trauma of the last 14 months. So we weren't in good shape. Then we know if you were already vulnerable, when something hits, it's usually going to be that much more devastating. So when you think about this, how do you think about getting a school culture, a principal, a workforce in a place of, let's think about that analogy used of the brain, getting that recovered to a point where we can think somewhat innovatively about doing things different. Because like I said, I've been enough part of a change process. I've studied it, formally and informally, that when folks are burned out and stressed out, change becomes so much more difficult. So how, if I would come to you, say, my staff, I am so burned out, I love what you're saying, how do I get us all to the point where we can start to implement some of these things, where I'm going to challenge folks to do something differently?
Okay, so that's a really good question, right? Change is not easy. People generally say they like change, but in words, but when actual change comes along, those old slippers feel really mighty good.
Yes.
And just saying something like, if ever there were a time for change, it's now, doesn't help with all that. I mean, as real and accurate as that is. So I do have a couple of thoughts on this. And I think we have to be practical here. And so while I am historically an academic, right? I mean, I made my way through the academy and was a professor for 2+ decades and a college president for 8 years and at the Department of Education. I think one question is, at what level are we seeking to make the change? Mm-hmm. Are we willing to make change locally within our school? or region or state or nationally. And I think there are actually different strategies. So when I was in Washington, working at the Department of Education, I was in the beginning regularly frustrated by not being able to make big change. And somebody said to me, a very smart person who actually wrote my tenure letter, as life turns out, who's now a senator, she said to me, your problem is you're trying to move the needle 180 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Move it 2 or 3. And that's 2 or 3 that it wouldn't have been moved before.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not a patient person. So 1 or 2 degrees is not enough for me. But we need people who will make change at 1 to 2 degrees, and other people who are working at the national level to make change through other means, whether it's through the Department of Education or through legislation or through advocacy work. So I think the answer is the change has to be multifaceted and from many different venues coming in. We can't just leave change and say to educators, you go make all the changes. They're like, what, are you nuts? Yeah. And they should say that.
Yeah.
Nor should, if you go to a hospital administrator, say, just change your hospital.
Yeah.
I mean, like, no, not really.
Right.
So I think you need both. You need a myriad of vectors to be working on change simultaneously. Now, that also is not common. We don't tend to work well together. We work well in our silos, sort of. And this is asking people to cross silos, both horizontally and vertically, which is really difficult. But I want to show you something as we get close to ending here, as a sort of way of saying this is all doable. So 2 things. I believe in hope. This is a little hope. Yeah. So when Pandora opened her box in the myth, and all the bad things fell out, that sort of feels like the world right now, right? You open Pandora's box and, look at what happens.
Yeah.
There is one thing that people forget about that Pandora's box story, which is there's one thing that never fell out of her box. Hope.
Yeah.
So I actually am optimistic and I have hope. So I want to share a strategy from a different nation that I think actually does work to help us think about this in a different way that gives us hope. So take a piece of pottery. It can be a plate or a bowl. And in Japanese tradition, when the bowl or pot breaks into pieces, we discard it. In American culture, that's what we do. We just say, oh, broken plate, throw it away. In Japanese culture, there's an art form called kintsugi, in which you put the pieces back together and seal them with gold. And you say, more beautiful for being broken.
Oh, love that.
And so here, piece together like this.
Very cool.
So doing this with people, actually breaking plates and putting them back together and displaying them, whether you do it at a school, in a community, in a house of worship, in a hospital, it's all about more beautiful for being broken. And so you can symbolically represent that and do that with groups of people in ways that allow us to see that and be reminded of that day in and day out.
Beautiful. So this has been a fabulous conversation. And I just want to thank you as somebody who does a work in and out of education. Whenever I walk into a homeless shelter, walk into a prison, walk into an addiction center, I just know that is filled with folks that, you know, we didn't recognize they were going through trauma during their childhood, and we didn't have that information. And so I'm not blaming anybody for this, but we've had these generations that, instead of naming it, like you said, and helping connect children and their families to resources to experience that beautiful post-traumatic growth, too many for too long have carried that pain and suffering into their adulthood. And your work and the growing army of folks in education now who are spreading this message, I think this is where real transformation is really going to happen. We get education is just a unique life experience where teachers, principals, educators get to know students in such a real and meaningful way that there's an ability to recognize and use that trust, hopefully, to bridge to treatment and services for the youth. But also hopefully we realize that a lot of families are struggling. Those were once kids who were struggling with their own trauma and still might be as well. And if we can make this shift at the educational level, what I hope is we can stop building prisons and homeless shelters and start maybe hiring more mental health therapists into schools, start to help more OT, more of these things that we know help to regulate that brain that's struggling at no fault of its own. And so I want to just thank you for your amazing work. And it's always great to connect with folks through this venue that I didn't know was out there fighting this revolution that we're all involved in. So I want to thank you so much for your work. And I think you only gave us 5 out of the 11. So I want to, you left us hanging there, which was a really smart thing to do, by the way. Where can people learn more about your work? You've written some great books. Tell people just that might be listening. We'll put it in the show notes at trauma-informedlens.org. But tell people that just might be listening how to learn more about you and your work.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's been a pleasure being with you. I hope what I've said is helpful to your listeners. And let me just share. I have a website. It's www.karengross, Gross, although it said like grows, you know, like a person grows, but it's karengrosseducation.com. And on that website are the adult books I've written on trauma, the most recent of which is Trauma Doesn't Stop at the School Door, sadly and aptly named. And then I have some downloadable PDFs that may be helpful to people. There's one called the Feeling Alphabet Activity Set that talks about naming and the importance of naming feelings and strategies for doing that. That's helpful to teachers and parents, and that's a downloadable PDF. There's a downloadable PDF on how to create a trauma-sensitive toolbox that students and adults can take with them to help them calm their autonomic nervous system. And other of my books is PDFs that are downloadable. It also has places I'm speaking and places where I'm teaching. It has a contact form if you want to reach me. I think the website is probably the best place. And I encourage your listeners to reach out. I do respond to everything. And I thank you for having me. And I appreciate the work you do as well.
Thank you. And thanks our listeners for joining us again, trauma-informedlens.org. Got a lot to put in the show notes about Karen and her work. And Karen, again, thank you so much for this great and really timely conversation as well.
Happy to be with you. Bye.